Hi, I'm Jaclyn.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
Welcome back to part 2 of our first 3-parter. So hopefully you guys enjoyed part 1. I never want to say enjoyed because it's not a pleasant experience, but you know.
We're intrigued, found it interesting.
Yes.
Maybe learned a few things.
Exactly. So when we do these 2-parters, we typically record back-to-back days. So Courtney and I don't really have a whole lot of updates for you guys because thankfully not much has happened in the last 24 hours, which is a blessing in the world of 2021 that we can go a whole 24 hours without breaking news stories. So I guess there's that.
Yeah, definitely. So I also decided to go on Twitter to see if there was any breaking news, I could see. Wasn't anything super interesting, but apparently hashtag Seth Rogen loves Ted Cruz was trending. I'm not exactly sure what that's about, but there's that, and people are also interested in what is Conor McGregor gonna do now that he lost his fight. I know people take UFC really seriously, but I'm like, I don't know, fight him again.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's all the breaking news from Twitter this morning. Courtney and I are very sore today because the workouts that we've been doing have been very leg heavy, and we've been doing a whole bunch of squats, so that's pleasant.
Yeah, our girl who comes up with the workouts has really, I guess, been emphasizing her legs and her butt. She's like, I'm gonna make sure my legs look real good. So
yep,
a lot of squats.
Yeah, so
it sucks, especially in my townhouse with two stairs, 3 levels, 2 sets of stairs that are big stairs. It sucked.
Yeah, so apparently Courtney and I are working on our legs and butts now, unintentionally, but that's all right, I guess. I guess it couldn't hurt, but that's all of the riveting updates in our lives is...
Yeah, I need a butt. I'm top heavy, so gotta even it out.
I mean, I'm already struggling to fit in all of my pants everywhere, so, it's great.
Okay, well, you're pregnant, so you're growing a child.
No, I mean, I don't need my butt to get any bigger because it's already struggling to get into my pants. So, I feel like the squats and stuff are just adding muscle, which is great, but then, again, harder to fit in my pants. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, that's life.
We hope you guys enjoyed this, again, riveting update of Courtney and Jaclyn's workout corner. So, you're welcome.
Yeah. I know you guys care so much.
Hopefully for part 3, we'll have some other updates because it'll be a week from now when we record. So, there's that. So, Courtney, are we ready to dive into part 2 of this son of a bitch?
I guess as ready as we'll ever be.
So we left off in part 1 with police finding the body of Carol Christensen, and that was in May of 1983. So we're just going to jump back into that general time frame.
And we also used all the same sources from part 1. So
yes.
And if you haven't listened to part 1, just go ahead and hit pause really quick and go listen. Hi, welcome back. Now you can continue because this probably won't make sense if you don't listen to part 1. But yeah, if you want our sources, go ahead and listen to part 1.
Yes. So 19-year-old Martina Teresa Otherly was last seen on May 22nd near the Red Lion Hotel. Her father was in the Army, and she had dreams of a service career too, but ultimately lost direction in her life after a medical discharge from the National Guard during basic training. Her parents weren't aware, but she then did turn to sex work, and she told her family that she was living in Oregon, so they weren't concerned when months went by and they hadn't heard from her. Cheryl Lee Wims was 18 years old when she disappeared from the Central District in Seattle on May 23rd, which was the night before her birthday. She was working as a busgirl in a downtown restaurant, and she had dropped out of school, but her parents had no reason to believe that she was engaged in sex work. Yvonne Antosh, 19 years old, was last seen on the Strip on May 30th. She had moved from Vancouver, British Columbia, to work in this area. 20-year-old Constance Elizabeth Naone drove a 15-year-old Chevrolet Camaro that she often parked at the Red Lion when she was working. And she did pretty well financially, but she did have a drug addiction that frequently took a lot of her money. She had a job at a sausage factory, and on June 8th, she planned to pick up her paycheck. She called her boyfriend to say that she was on the way to visit him and would be there in 20 minutes, but she never arrived. Police found her Camaro in the Red Lion parking lot in late June. There was nothing in there that could indicate what had happened to her. So 18-year-old Kelly Kay McGinnis split her time between Portland and Seattle, and in the summer of 1983, she and her boyfriend left Portland to see what was going on in Seattle at that time. The last time anyone who knew her remembered seeing her was around 7:30 p.m. on June 28th, and that night she was wearing a tan, short-sleeved sweater, blue jeans, and a long camel hair coat and high heels. Kelly's boyfriend reported her missing the next day, but the police sergeant wasn't convinced that she had met foul play because he'd seen too many adults and older teenagers just leave of their own accord. But she literally was taken from the same spot that so many other women had been taken from in the last year. So you'd think that would set off some red flags for you.
Yeah.
So Kelly's boyfriend insisted that she would have told him if she was okay, but many others believed that she had just run off and decided to start a new life. She did have the looks and the brains to accomplish anything she wanted, and she could have easily slipped into an upper-class lifestyle. So Kelly was born on April 17th, 1965 in Seattle. Her parents divorced when she was around 2.5, and she was very close to her mom. Her mother eventually remarried a wealthy entrepreneur, and they lived in a mansion that had 16 rooms and was worth over $2 million. And that's in 1960-ish money.
Yeah.
So Kelly had her own horse there, and she received riding lessons, music lessons, exclusive summer camps, and orthodontia that corrected her overbite. And Kelly's mom and stepdad both worked a lot, so she spent a lot of time with babysitters and housekeepers, and she was pretty lonely, but she adored time with her mother. The family took a lot of nice trips to Hawaii and went on cruises, but her mother and stepfather eventually divorced, and Kelly just had a really hard time with this. Her mom did remarry quickly, but her new stepfather was not as nice as the previous one. Her mom came home early from work one day and saw him throwing a rocking chair at Kelly, and her leg was already bruised from a beating with a wooden coat hanger, so Kelly's mother did end their marriage. Which good for her, because as we've talked about before so many times, they don't. They pick the husband.
Yeah, when I read that, I was like, wow, good for her that she actually was just like, nope, not happening, goodbye.
Yeah, I'm like, nope, we're not going to do this. So Kelly started to act out around age 13. So this is a normal age to go through a lot of changes, and she had so many changes so quickly. So her grades did drop, and she began to run away from home, but only for a day or two. She just really became very sullen and defiant. And one night, Kelly was babysitting, and 5 drunk men knocked on the door and gang raped her. So around 3 a.m., her mom received a call to come to the hospital and found her 13-year-old daughter traumatized to the point that she couldn't speak. And Kelly had known some of the boys and was afraid of them because they were leaders in a wilder crowd at the local high school. So she was afraid to testify against them because she was ashamed and also afraid that they would hurt her. So Kelly then soon turned to sex work and became pregnant at age 15 by a boy that she really loved. And Kelly carried 2 babies to term before she turned 18. The first baby, a boy, she decided should be adopted, but both parents really regretted this, and she was pregnant again within 6 months. So they had planned this baby as much as they were able to because they thought the second baby would improve their love and show their families that they were mature. So the second baby was a little girl, and the father's mother was willing to help raise the baby, but Kelly's mother disapproved of their relationship because her boyfriend was black, and she blamed him for her lifestyle. But Kelly chose her lifestyle because she couldn't make the same amount of money doing other work as she did doing sex work. So Kelly obviously had trouble working with a baby, and she didn't want to put her baby up for adoption, but she asked her to be placed into a foster home only long enough for her to serve jail time for an earlier arrest. So she couldn't say when she was coming back, and there was no one to watch her, even though they all said that they loved her. So Kelly did show up to jail on May 25th and served 7 days while her baby was placed in a foster home. So Kelly knew about the Green River Killer, but she did take precautions. She never got in cars and took clients to a hotel room instead, as she just really believed that it wouldn't happen to her. But Kelly did spend another 3 days in jail on June 21st, and she had to be back in Seattle for a court appearance on the 28th, and she didn't show up, so the judge issued a bench warrant for her arrest. According to her boyfriend, Kelly just didn't want to go to court, so they spent the day together. And she checked into the Three Bears Motel and went looking for a client that night and was never seen again. Kelly's daughter was eventually adopted when no one came to pick her up. 23-year-old Kelly Ware went missing on July 18th, 1983, and was last seen near the same spot as Cheryl Wims. So the friends and family of 16-year-old Carrie Ann Royce struggled with her disappearance. She probably vanished around mid-July of 83, and originally a friend thought that she had gone missing in March, but the task force talked to enough people to know that she had been seen on Memorial Day weekend and maybe for a month or so after that. So Carrie's mother had been married twice after she divorced from Carrie's dad, and Carrie told a social worker in spring of 1982 that her stepfather had molested her. She did remain in the home until the second time that she reported that he was sexually abusing her, and then Carrie went to live with her father, but they didn't get along. Carrie claimed that her father hit her and left bumps on her head, so she ran away and went to the youth service center, and her father told the center to send her home, but she refused to go and ran away again, and she did have a lot of friends that she would frequently stay with. So her mother, Judy, left the husband that Carrie reported had abused her. Again, good for you.
Yeah.
A lot of good moms right now. But Carrie still would not return home with her. So her mom just worried constantly about her daughter, and on Christmas Eve of 1982, Carrie called Judy and said that she missed her, so they spent Christmas Eve together, but Carrie still didn't want to move back in. Carrie had a court-appointed guardian, and Judy couldn't force her to come home. She was in a group home, and she got along well with everyone, and one social worker remembered that she idolized Brooke Shields, who she even resembled, and she wanted to be a model one day. Carrie loved parties and would experiment with marijuana, cocaine, and alcohol, and there was reason to believe that Carrie had been alive until at least some part of July, and she had been making a living through sex work before she went missing. Another teenager disappeared from the same area, again midsummer of 83. Her name was Tammy Lyles, and she was 16 years old, and she was estranged from her family, so no one even reported her missing. And again, like we talked about in last week's episode, it's just so sad that so many of these we only have a single sentence about because no one knew much about them, or they didn't have strong social connections. They weren't reported missing for so long, which is what allowed this man to continue killing at the rapid pace that he did. So Rose Johnson, which is an alias, vanished sometime between 1982 and 1984, and her life before she turned to sex work was very rough. She had dropped out of school before graduating and was allegedly the target of incest by several male members of the family. And now we have not such a good mother, because her mother blamed her daughter for the breakup of her marriage because rather than taking Rose's side, she saw her as a rival, which again we unfortunately see so often, which is awful and disgusting.
Which is such like a fucked up mentality. Like,
right?
Oh, you're abusing my daughter? Well, now I have competition. What?
Yeah.
What?
Like, so she sided with her husband and accused Rose of trying to seduce her father. And this isn't even her stepfather. Not that that, like, makes a difference in the grand scheme of things, but, like, this was her biological father. Mm-hmm. So he was enraged that she told on him, so he took her bedroom door off the hinges so she had no privacy, and she had to get dressed in her closet or behind a blanket. And when her window was broken in the coldest part of winter, her father refused to fix it, so she would just freeze in her bedroom. He also padlocked the cupboards and the refrigerator so she couldn't find anything to eat at home, so it was up to her to survive any way that she could. So with this, she did turn to sex work. She bought an old car, and if she couldn't find enough money to pay for a hotel room, she would sleep in the car. And Rose was obviously very afraid of her mother, and even after her father moved out, she wouldn't return home because it was still dangerous. A friend of Rose's said that she met her mother once, and she was so mean to Rose that she couldn't believe that her own mother had said such horrible things to her. One of the barbers at a local business where she would park her car saw her frequently coming to and from her car with different men, and then he then noticed one day that she didn't return. He later saw her picture in the paper talking about how she had been found dead, and the barber who noticed her missing would never know that the man who would eventually be caught for all of these murders was actually a regular customer of his.
Which I thought was like so eerie.
Yeah.
And also, I don't think we mentioned this in the notes, but I'd always remembered this because apparently also Anne Rule was going around like on book tours, and she was kind of talking about the Green River Killer, and she's like, well, I'm not going to do anything until he's caught. Like, that's how I write my books. Mm-hmm. And her daughter even was like, when the man was found, she was like, I saw this man come to one of your book readings. Like,
yeah.
And that is so creepy.
And Anne said plenty of times that on these book tours because she lived in the area. She's like, I'm sure this is someone who's sat next to me at a restaurant or been behind me in the checkout line at the grocery store, or, I'm sure I've seen him many times because we all live and work in the same community, and it has to be somebody that we're familiar with.
Yeah, and she lived really close to, like, where the women were being taken, like, all that. And I think she even made a joke once, like, he could be in this room, and, like, that would have been true at some point. Like,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
so creepy.
It really is just, like, super, like, eerie and just uncomfortable. So at this point, it had been almost a year since the 5 women were found in the Green River, but the only other victim's body who had been located and linked to the Green River killer was Giselle Lavorne. And Carol Ann's body had been found, but at this time they weren't certain if she was associated with him, because remember, that was the scene that was very ritualistic and not like the others, so they weren't sure if they were connected or not. So at this point, we have all of these missing women and only 6 bodies found that they're pretty sure are tied to him. So on August 11th, a couple had gone to pick apples from some abandoned trees where Giselle Lavorne was left. And the couple stumbled upon bones behind 3 empty houses, and the dental charts matched the skull to that of Shonda Lee Summers. She had been missing since October of 1982, and it was impossible to determine cause of death because her body was so decayed. There were no broken bones, no skull fractures, no bullet holes nicking the bones that they'd found, and animals had scattered the hyoid that would have indicated strangulation. So they really just couldn't determine what had happened to her based on the way that her remains were found. And 2 days later, another set of remains were found buried nearby, but there was nothing to identify them. So then the name Bones was officially added as a possible victim to the Green River Killer list, which again is just so sad.
Yeah, it is so sad, and it's kind of like we talked about in Ted Bundy that, like, Ann Roll brought up, is like,
yes,
Ted Bundy killed so many women and he completely stripped them of their identities. And that's kind of what's happening here again, is there are some, like, remains that have been found that are only known as bones, or some women who went missing who we'll probably never find. So I think it's just really heartbreaking how he's just completely stripped them of their life and their identity.
Absolutely.
It's just, they're a Green River killer victim, which is just heartbreaking. So April Dawn Buttram had been an obedient child, but she hit a rebellious streak, like many of us do. She quit school and she turned to drugs and alcohol. She lived in Spokane with her family, and when she was 17, her mother caught her sneaking out the window to go to Seattle with some girlfriends. And so her mom told her, if you want to leave, just leave out the front door. So April did. And her and her friends split up a few days after they arrived in Seattle. April was last seen in the Rainier Valley in southeast Seattle mid-August 1983. She'd be turning 18 soon and planned to return home to withdraw $10,000 from a trust that a family member had set up for her to access when she turned 18. April never returned home for this money, and her family was in denial that something had happened to her, and she wasn't reported missing until March 24th, 1984. So quite a few months later.
Yeah, quite a while before they reported her missing. And I mean, I get, like, if you're in denial, but your 17-year-old has $10,000 waiting for her as soon as she turns 18, she's going to come home for that money, like 100%.
Yeah. Deborah Mae Abernathy was from Waco, Texas, and moved to Seattle in July of 1983 with her boyfriend and 3-year-old son looking for a fresh start. They soon ran out of money, and a local couple offered them a room in their house until they could get back on their feet. Deborah was last seen by her boyfriend walking towards downtown Seattle on September 5th, 1983, and she was 26 years old. Tracy Ann Winston came from a close-knit family with 2 younger brothers, but she started to rebel around age 13. She spent some time in the King County Jail for loitering in September of 1983. She paid her bail money to get out of jail on September 12th and was last seen by a cab driver she knew walking along Cherry Street away from the jail. He pulled up to talk to her, but she needed a ride in the opposite direction of where he was already taking a customer. Which I'm like, if I'm in that cab and he's like, hey, do you want to jump in? I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not paying for like 3 people here.
Yeah, wait a minute.
Wait a minute. He told her to wait and he'd be back for her in 45 minutes, but Tracy was gone when he returned. Tracy had been embarrassed to be in jail and begged her family not to come pick her up because she didn't want them to see her like this, and she swore she was going to turn her life around after this experience. So at the time of her birth, Tracy's dad, Chuck, was preparing to go into the Air Force, and her mom, Myrtie, was living with her grandmother. So Tracy's mom was unable to work and care for her, so she temporarily placed her into foster care. She soon got her baby back because she realized it wasn't the best thing for any of them to be apart. So Myrtie and Tracy then followed Chuck to a couple of different Air Force bases during this time when he was in the service, and they eventually decided they'd return to Seattle and he would work at Boeing. They also briefly moved to Fresno, California, but they did later return to the Seattle area. Tracy's younger brothers were born during this time when they were moving a lot, and Tracy had a close bond with her dad, and they loved playing baseball together. And Tracy was only one of 2 girls allowed to join the boys' Little League team, so that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was super cool, I thought.
Tracy began to butt heads with her mom as a teenager, and they fought because she thought her mom was too controlling and wouldn't let her make her own decisions. And Tracy did find out that her mom had put her into foster care as a baby, and she was furious and claimed that her mother never really loved her.
And I feel like her story is just so sad because it sounds so, like, typical of a 16-year-old, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, I want to be independent and I want to do this, and then my mom is trying to control all of my decisions because she's trying to do what's best for me, and now I'm getting upset over things that happened when I was a child. And, like, it's just all so very typical that so many people are able to work through and get out of that, you know? Mm-hmm. And then some of them unfortunately just end up down a different path and they can't get out of it, and it's just really sad.
Yeah, those teenage years are...
Whew.
They'll be hard. Are you excited for that with
oh boy.
the upcoming year?
We got some time to worry about that. If any of you guys are raising teenagers, I apologize and give me all the advice. Thank you.
So Tracy started dating a 19-year-old boy who was in and out of trouble, and he spent time in prison when they were together. So Tracy, again, was only 16 at this time. So her parents tried to forbid him from seeing him because he's older and in prison.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, anytime you tell your kids don't do something, that just makes them want it more.
Absolutely.
And that's what happened. And after he was released from prison, Tracy started staying with him, always at different friends' houses, and her dad would go out at night looking for her. Tracy would still visit her family, but she wouldn't tell them where she was living. She was almost 20 at this time, and Tracy's mom was unsure if she'd ever engaged in sex work or not. And the night she called her parents from jail, and she told them she was really changing and she wanted to get her GED and make her parents proud of her. So several weeks went by and they hadn't heard from Tracy, but her mom became really concerned but when she didn't visit or call for Thanksgiving and reported her missing at that time. So Tracy's cousin Chris said she ran into Tracy one time in the fall of 1983, likely around September. She was in a truck with an older man that she introduced as Gary. She said Gary was helping her look for a job, and Chris said he made her uncomfortable, so she just kind of made an excuse to get out of the car as soon as she could. And on September 18th, what would become known as the Star Lake Road site was discovered. Someone walking by found skeletized remains, and it was very close to the road, so it seemed unlikely they'd been there all along, and no one had smelled like the decomposition. That is a very strong, unique smell that you would know.
Yeah.
So the remains had also self-buried, which kind of means they had sank deeper into the earth naturally as more time had passed. And it would be a pretty long time before police discovered that these were the remains of Gail Matthews. Maureen Feeney moved out on her own into a little apartment in January of 1983 and started working at the East Side Christian School. Maureen had struggled with her self-image in high school and had engaged in self-harming behaviors. She'd always been shy and never had a boyfriend, and her friends were surprised when they talked to her on the phone and she'd been out drinking at clubs. She had to move into a new apartment because her landlord wanted to rent it out to a family member, and the area she moved to wasn't as safe. And she started working at a daycare in late summer, early fall of 1983 and met a new boyfriend shortly after that. Her family was concerned about the area she was living in, and her brother even sent her money to move home, but she said she didn't want to move home because she and her boyfriend were going to move to California, and she said he had lots of ways of making money. On September 28th, 1 week before her 20th birthday, Maureen left her apartment between 5 and 6 p.m. to go to the 7-Eleven. Her boyfriend said he fell asleep after she left, and when he woke up around 11 p.m., she had still not returned. And her boyfriend speculated she may have gone to a dance club to inquire about a job because she had circled it in the paper, and she had also told her boss at the daycare that she wouldn't need the job much longer because she had come into some money. Also, in September of 1983, police received a letter from someone claiming to be the Green River Killer. It was completely full of spelling mistakes. Sounds a little like BTK here.
A little bit.
The writer titled his work, Going About Catching the GRK. He stated that he had been with 20 to 40 more sex workers that he didn't kill because he needed them alive in case he ever got caught, so they could say he hadn't hurt them. And he ridiculed the police for having poor relationships with the sex workers and said they should have better relations with them. Around this time, more women went missing. Mary Sue Bello, age 25, disappeared on October 11th. Almost everyone who met Mary liked her, and her family really treasured her. She chose to engage in sex work very early, and her mother worried, but Mary believed she was streetwise enough to be okay. And Mary's mother, Sue, had gotten pregnant and given birth to her when she was only 15, and Sue tried to marry the father, but he went to prison before Mary turned 6 months old. So I feel like we're seeing a lot of this too, of like mothers who have their kids very young.
And just really don't have the social support and connections they need to be able to raise these children. Super sad.
So Mary grew up believing her grandparents were her parents and Sue was her sister, which I feel like happened way more than we think it did.
Yeah. We also find out about so many of these, afterwards that I'm like, how many just never told them that, like, they just spent their whole life knowing that,
Yeah, it's definitely crazy. And I feel like it's a little different today, only because we're a little bit more accepting of, like, people getting pregnant young, and it's not as, like, my family will be in ruins if the neighbors find out. But
yeah, you're not going to be disowned for getting pregnant at 16, 18.
I mean, there's a
20.
show about it. I mean, teen mom, 16 and pregnant. Like, you get money for it now. But so once Mary found out at the age of 10, she kind of became rebellious and full of distrust. She kind of just felt betrayed. And so when Mary was 12, Sue tried to buy a house across the street and hoped to make a home for her daughter, but it was kind of a little too late. And Mary would not listen to anyone. She ran away repeatedly, quickly got into drugs, and she learned that she could make older men do things for her because she was pretty. Mary wasn't 13 yet when she was committed to Grand Mound, which is the Washington State training school for adolescent girls, and her mom said it was the only education she had, even though she was very intelligent. Mary was emancipated when she was 15, and she had trouble keeping traditional jobs, so she started in sex work. And at 19, Mary wanted to know about her father. So Sue told her where to find him, and she went with her because she really didn't know what Mary's father would do. And it's a good thing because Mary's father did try to rape her. He locked her in his house and wouldn't let her out. And so Sue came and pounded on the door until he let her out. And this was a big blow for Mary, realizing she'd just never have a relationship with her father.
And, I just don't... your long-lost daughter shows up, and your first thought is, I should rape you. I want to have sex with you. What?
Yeah, it's disgusting. And just such, a heartbreaking blow, blow after blow. You find out, oh, my sister is actually my mom, so I've been lied to. Well, let me meet my father. Oh, now he's a piece of shit. That's really hard to kind of, deal with, especially because she is so young, too.
Yeah, definitely.
So Mary was a rebel, but she was also very kind, and she'd help anyone in need. She had a great sense of humor, she was a good cook, and loved spending the holidays with her family. Mary did go to prison for robbery because she was waiting in the car while her boyfriend went in to rob a takeout restaurant, but she didn't know about the robbery and only thought he was going in to pick up their food. Sue frequently begged Mary to stop sex work, but Mary refused. She liked to make money this way, and Sue became even more worried with the Green River Killer, but Mary assured her that he would never get to her. Mary was very aware of this threat and had even called a detective she knew on the task force in September of 1983 about a client who was very weird and had lots of knives in his car and his house. This tip did become a huge part of the permanent file on the unsolved Green River cases. So, Mary knew this was a possibility and was trying to take any precautions she could.
Mm-hmm.
In the summer of 1983, Mary was trying to overcome her heroin addiction, which required a 15-mile trip to Tacoma every day to get methadone to ease her withdrawals. In October, Sue saw her daughter for the last time. She became concerned when her birthday, Thanksgiving, and Christmas passed with no call because she was frequently in touch with her family. Her grandmother believed that she had just run off and wasn't missing.
And I believe it was Mary in the book. There were several, so it may have been someone else too, but that her mom said the last time she saw her, she felt like she knew it was the last time. And I feel like several of the mothers said that too, that they're like, the last time I saw them at this restaurant or when they came over or whatever and we hugged goodbye, I just had a feeling that this was the last time I was going to see them, which is just so sad because we see so many of them who are trying to maintain these connections with their families, and they do have an okay relationship with their moms, and their moms want to save them, but as we talked about before, the more you try to stop somebody from doing something, the more they pull away, and so they're just kind of stuck in a hard spot of what do you do,
Yeah. So Yvonne Shelley Antosh came to Seattle from British Columbia. She had been living in a motel with the girls she'd known since they were children. Her skeletized remains were found on October 15th. Pammy Annette Avent was back in Seattle on October 26th from working in Portland for a while, and her friends last saw her on that date in Rainier Valley area. Connie Naone, who had gone missing on June 8th, 1983, was found on October 27th very close by Yvonne. 2 days later, in the same area, detectives located the remains of Kelly Ware, and she had last been seen alive on July 18th. On October 28th, Patricia Ann Osborne, age 19, was last seen in Seattle close to the city limits. Her parents lived in Oregon and didn't realize that she was gone, and when she didn't contact them over the holidays, they reported her missing, but she'd actually been missing for 3 months at this point.
Then on October 30th, around 3 p.m., Delise Louise Plager, age 22, was expected at a friend's house. So Delise wanted to retrieve a few of her items and was supposed to be taking the bus to the house. So she went by Missy and had been called that since she was a little girl. And she was temporarily living with another friend. She had 2 kids of her own, but she was having a really hard time supporting them. And poor Missy had a rough life from the beginning. She was technically born dead, but was able to be resuscitated. Her mother was found to be unfit to take care of her and her twin brother John when they were around age 5, partially due to her alcoholism. So Missy was adopted, but her adoptive parents found her difficult to deal with. She was very hyperactive, and she just really needed patience and special medication. And she also lost her brother when they were adopted to different families. So Missy tried looking for him, but the family who adopted him wanted to cut ties with his past, so she was never allowed to see him or contact him. And a really kind social worker did tell Missy that she was able to see him and that he was okay, but she couldn't tell her where he was. And all of these stories are so sad, but for some reason Missy's just really, really got to me. And we'll get into more, it gets worse, but just from the very beginning, and I don't know, being separated from your sibling and your twin, and his parents not letting her have any kind of contact with him. I'm sure they had their reasons, but goodness,
Yeah, that's really rough. And so many of these women just had such tragic childhoods and such horrible things happen to them, and then had such a tragic end, and it just really sucks. The cards some of them were dealt in life. It was just, just sad.
I know, it really is. And so many of them were so young too that it's maybe they would have been able to turn their lives around eventually, and they just never got that chance. So back to Missy. So around 10 or 11, she was sent to the Antonian School for Special Children, and they did the best they could to help her. She did go home to visit her adoptive parents on the weekends, and she was medicated for ADHD only on Saturdays and Sundays, which is unusual because a lot of the times it's the other way around. You're only medicated when you need to be in a classroom setting. But the school's director, Sister Antonia, did not believe that hyperactive children should be treated with pharmaceuticals, so Missy was only medicated when she went home to her parents because they wanted her medicated. So every time she would come back at the end of the weekend, she was going through chemical withdrawal again week after week.
Yeah, and really, like, her adoptive parents were like, you're just too much. And I feel like they just gave her medicine because they were like, will you just chill? Like, will you just sit there, and not giving her the attention she, like, actually needed.
And don't get me wrong, I'm sure it is very, very difficult to adopt a child who has these emotional problems, but you also adopted a 5-year-old child. I don't know what you were expecting. Like...
And you only see her 2 days a week?
Yeah. So one time after she came back from the weekend, she did have a bruise on her bottom. So Missy really struggled with being overly physically affectionate, as many children with poor attachment in infancy do. And one time, Missy's adoptive mother attended a school performance, and Missy was just so happy and overwhelmed that she actually came that she just cried through the whole performance. And, like, that part alone just, like, broke me. Like, this poor girl who just wants love and affection, and she's so excited that, like, her mom actually came to something that she, like, can't even do what she's there to do because she just cries the whole time because she's so happy she actually came. Like, oh my goodness, this one's rough. So eventually her emotional problems did escalate, and at this time she was placed into a more secure residential facility where she was allowed even fewer visits home. So they're really just, like, pushing her further and further away into, like, an institutionalized setting. And as life continues to get worse for her, Missy was in a really bad car accident in 1977. Her hip and jaw were broken and her skull fractured, but she did survive. So, like, life is just constantly throwing hurdles at this poor girl. So Missy had her daughter Nicole in 76 or 77 when she was 16, and she had a little boy named Daryl in 1979 when she was 18. So Missy was able to reconnect with her brother and birth parents after a girl she met told her that she looked so much like her boyfriend that she could be his twin. Which I thought was just crazy that, like, she just met this girl randomly and she's like, you look just like my boyfriend, and it was her twin brother.
Yeah.
So she did meet her biological mom in person, but it ended up being a disaster. Her mom was raising other children at this time, and she was thinking, oh, because Missy's older, like, she's gonna not need me, like, she's gonna be okay, and she just really didn't expect her to have as many problems as she did at that time. And her mother actually told her, quote, you've got so many problems, maybe it would have been better if they hadn't resuscitated you when you were born. So around 1982, Missy attempted suicide, and in the summer of 1983, she became addicted to drugs. So Missy was afraid that she would lose her kids, so she was really trying to get her life back together so she could keep them. She did turn to sex work to try to get enough money for an apartment to be able to keep her kids in. And her friend said that she had strict limits about the sex acts that she would perform. And in the early fall of 83, she was attending parenting classes in the hopes of keeping her children. So she did disappear right before Halloween when she never showed up at her friend's house to get the Halloween costume that she was going to lend someone. So Kimberly Nelson grew up in Michigan, and she dropped out of high school in the 11th grade and made her way to Seattle. Her mother, stepfather, and sisters were very worried about her. She went by many names: Kim, Tina, Star. So it was kind of hard to keep track of her movements because she did go by so many different names. But in October of 1983, she was around 3 or 4 months pregnant and had been arrested for sex work. And she told her sister that she wouldn't be home for Christmas that year because she couldn't afford the trip. So her mother sent her money, but she still never showed up. And after the holidays, Kim's boyfriend called her family and asked if she was there, and they told him they hadn't talked to her since long before Christmas. So Kim got out of jail just before Halloween and moved into the Ben Carroll Motel with her friend Paige. Paige reported her missing on October 31st, which would only be 20 hours after Missy vanished. And Paige said that Kim was not scared of anything, and she really believed that she could take care of herself, and she told Paige that she was only working long enough to earn rent money. So Paige went with a client, and when she got back, Kim wasn't there, and she thought that Kim had found a client, but then she never returned home.
Which I thought was weird how they wouldn't let Kurt, Gail's boyfriend, file a police report because he wasn't related.
Yeah.
But Paige was able to. So, and again, like, a lot of this kind of happens, like, different counties, different, you know, police departments, a lot of different jurisdictions happening here. So
yes.
It could just be, you know, different police officers, you know, giving different answers. But I just think if, all these women were allowed to be reported in like a timely manner. Like maybe it gone a little different, but who knows?
Definitely. And because we know even in the same jurisdiction, different police officers may respond differently. Some may say, like, just the individual may be like, yes, you can report this person missing, or no, you can't. Like, it's kind of up to them, Like, even if there are policies in place, they might not always follow them that way.
And, like, since Gail wasn't, like, a known sex worker, it could have been just like, okay, this boyfriend's reporting her missing. He saw her in the truck with another guy. Okay, yeah, I don't think she's missing. As opposed to this where it's like, she's a known sex worker. We have sex workers going missing, so could be that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, like they're just looking for people that fit the profile of what they're expecting, and then other people are like, oh no, it's not tied to this at all. So on November 13th of 1983, the task force detectives found out that the Green River Killer had buried a girl in a wooded area, and her body also contained her nearly full-term fetus who had died with her. So the girl lay face up with her knees slightly bent to the left and was no more than 2 to 3 feet down. So in this grave was Mary Bridget Meehan, who is the girl that had already lost her first 2 babies to a miscarriage and then was now murdered along with this baby. So at the end of 1983, the King County Sheriff was trying to convince the department to put more money into the investigation, but they didn't feel that, quote, the county's image would be improved by spending taxpayers' money on investigating the murders of hookers. Which again, just shows you how much certain people in this investigation cared about the girls who were going missing. So protests started because the citizens wanted their community cleaned up and sex work gone. And one woman was even quoted as saying that the Green River Killer might start abducting nice girls soon. So she's like, I don't give a shit that he's killing all these sex workers, but like if this continues, I mean, he might come after us and then I'll really care.
And there were a lot of men and officers on the task force who did care deeply. I do want to say that too, like they devoted a lot of time and effort and wanted to, solve these and cared. There were a lot of those, but there were also, the community, like the people who give them the funding who were just like, we don't really care.
Yeah, it really seems like the detectives on the task force, like they really cared about these girls, and we'll see later that they tried to work with the sex workers who were still out on the street to try to keep them safe, like they really do care about them and they're trying to help them as much as they can. But like you said, whoever is determining the funding and the people higher up and the citizens in general are like, I don't care because they're just hookers. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, because when I was reading the book, I was like very pleasantly surprised with how it seemed like the people on the task force were working with the sex workers, and if like because sex workers were coming to them with tips and stuff like that, so I was glad they had formed that connection where it's like, we're not going to punish you, like just come and tell us like anything, like we'll help you.
They're like, we really do want you to be safe, like we're not going to punish you for trying to help us, And many citizens were outraged because obviously the issue was the women engaging in sex work and not the man who was murdering them. Like, that's not what's causing all of this chaos. It's because you're engaging in sex work in the first place. And one lieutenant suggested that they increase patrolling the clients who bought sex, not the women who sold it. But the citizen said the issue was obviously with the women who were out there with no respect for themselves. So they're like, no, we don't want you to patrol these men who are buying sex. We only want you to patrol the women who are selling it, because it clearly only goes one way.
And that's my thing too, is I'm like, this is such messed up thinking. I'm like, there would not be sex workers if there were not clients.
Yeah.
Like, clients are the ones who like determine it. Like,
exactly. It just makes no sense. So on December 20th, Kimmy Kai Pistor's skull was found in Mountain View Cemetery, about 18 miles south of the airport and 30 miles from where she was last seen in downtown Seattle. Her identity was confirmed through dental records. So we are seeing now these bodies are being found all over the place. So 19-year-old Lisa Lorraine Yates disappeared on September 23rd. She was supposed to be taking her 9-year-old niece for a picnic. She was living with her sister's family after being shuttled around from multiple homes during her childhood. Mary Exetta West disappeared from the Rainier Valley neighborhood on February 6, 1984. She lived with her aunt and was always very thoughtful about coming home on time. She left her aunt's house around mid-morning that Monday, and a month from then, Mary would have turned 17. She was also about 3 months pregnant, but very few people knew that. In late winter and early spring of 1984, the reports of missing women started slowing down and then eventually just stopped completely. So while the murders seemed to slow down, the recovery of missing women sped up. And in February and March, a new cluster site surfaced, and an earlier disposal area yielded another body fragment. And on October 14th, skeletal remains were found at the base of Mount Washington, and the medical examiner tried to identify her through dental records but was not successful, and she became simply known as Bones number 8 and had been dead between 3 to 6 months. On February 19th, a partial human jawbone was discovered near where Kimi Kai Pistor's skull was found, and it was not immediately tied to the identity of any of the victims. Then on February 20th, Post-Intelligencer reporter Mark Barber, who had written extensively about the Green River cases, had a letter routed to him from the city desk. It had arrived in a small plain white envelope with a Seattle postmark, and the sender had added very important, spelled INPORTENT, to the envelope. So the message inside had no spaces at all between the words and seemed to be like a code, and he looked at it several times trying to understand, and eventually it started to make a little bit more sense. And it looked like it was saying what you need to know about the Green River Man and listed 40 lines of things about him, but with very poor spelling and grammar, really hard to read and understand. And the letter was signed, "Call me Fred." So they assumed that the letter had probably been written by someone not named Fred, who was trying to play detective. So he was offering motives that anyone might think of, but also details that weren't generally known. So the man did turn it over to the task force, and they tried to examine it for fingerprints, and one was found that could possibly be saved. So they sent the letter to FBI profilist John Douglas to evaluate its content. So he didn't believe that it was written by the real Green River Killer and that this was the threat of a copycat. So it's still not officially known whether the letter was real, but Ann Rule believes it was, and the killer who's caught later confessed that he had written letters to the Post-Intelligencer. So it's probably likely that it actually came from him.
And in the letter, it also included information that most people did not know, including, our first victims who were found in the river, who had like the rock, put into their vaginas. Like that was included in the letter, and most people didn't know that. So it did contain like a lot of this information that the public would not know.
Yep, definitely. So at this time, talking more about what the police are doing for the sex workers, detectives did create a proactive team where they placed female officers dressed as sex workers on the street to wait for clients. And male police officers would stay nearby to watch them and they would signal that a client was interested. So they thought that eventually the killer would approach the wrong woman and be caught. And they did focus on arresting and questioning the clients and not the sex workers. But in March of 1984, the Women's Coalition to Stop the Green River Murders mobilized. So they planned to march in a Take Back the Night and were very vocal about their unhappiness with the task force. So men were not allowed to march in the parade, but they were encouraged to watch and show support. And sex workers from San Francisco and London came to stand in place for the local sex workers who were too scared to publicly announce their job and be singled out in a crowd. So detectives on the task force were getting pretty annoyed by this because, they're trying to follow these different leads and tips and nothing was just panning out, and they felt that these sit-ins and marches were just getting in their way because there's been so many murders and the people are so upset because they want them to do something and they're like, we're trying our best, we're working with what we can, and like there's only so much we can do, but it does seem that they really tried on this case. So on March 13th, another skeleton was discovered about 300 yards from where Bones number 8 was found. Her hands and one part of her arm were missing, and a pair of women's underwear were found in the general region, but they weren't sure if it was connected to the skeleton, which they determined had been there about 2 to 4 months. And the skeleton was identified as Lisa Lorraine Yates, who had disappeared about 2 days before Christmas. So investigators didn't realize it yet, but the man they would identify as the Green River Killer had been stopped and questioned by detectives at this time. So the detective took his information and wrote a field report, but he was just one face among so many that didn't appear to be a viable suspect. He would eventually be stopped again, But at this time, the proactive team was developing a rapport with the working girls as well as protecting them. So when they needed information about one of the men who picked them up, the girls did give it to them. They would also follow them and make sure that they got in and out of clients' vehicles okay. So again, they're just really trying to look out for them here.
And I think that's why it was frustrating for them with these marches and sit-ins, is because I'm sure most of like regular citizens didn't know how much they were actually doing.
Yes,
like how much
absolutely.
they weren't saying, we're trying really hard here. We just can't tell you what we're doing because we can't tell the killer what we're doing. So
yeah,
I'm sure it was very frustrating to be doing a lot of work and be like, I'm doing work. You just can't see it.
Yeah, definitely.
So 17-year-old Cindy Smith had left home and was living in California. In March 1984, Cindy called her mother Joan to say that she was coming home, and she was engaged and happy, and she wanted to come back to her family. On March 21st, Cindy disappeared. She had been heading for her brother's job on her first day back at home. Also, on March 21st, a man's dog came up to him with a human bone in his mouth. Just not what you want to see.
Nope.
And police found the rest of the remains nearby. It was that of a young female, and she was to be Bones number 10. The search that followed was the largest so far in the investigation, and the next day, a search dog found the remains of 18-year-old Cheryl Lee Wims, who'd been missing 10 months at this point. So the task force had gotten a new commissioner, Frank Admonson, and he felt they were really closing in on the killer, and he was like, we've recovered about 18 victims, like something has to break through, there has to be something that we're going to find him. Little did they know it'd be nearly 20 years before they did find the killer. On March 31st, a man and his son were hiking when they came across the skeletal remains of a female in an entirely new location. So it was very far away from the other locations, and Frank Admonson was skeptical that it was connected to the Green River murder since it was so far away, and they weren't able to make a positive identification, but the bones were saved just in case. And there was a new freeway nearby, and this location was near an exit where trucks stopped frequently, which had the task force wondering if this killer could be a long-haul trucker. Also on March 31st, a skull was found by a mushroom hunter near Star Lake Road, which is where Gail Matthews had been found 6 months earlier. So searchers soon found the rest of the skeleton, and bones from more than 3 additional skeletons were found at this time as well. So they now had 20 bodies that they believed could be attributed to the Green River Killer, and the bodies found here would later be identified as Terry Renee Milligan, Dolores Williams, Sandra K. Gabbert, and Alma Ann Smith, and they had all gone missing at different times. So on April 19th, Barbara Kubik Patton, the local psychic we mentioned in part 1, who was kind of inserting herself into the investigation, showed up to a site where another body had been found. So this body was believed at the time and later confirmed to not be a victim of the Green River Killer. However, Barbara claimed the dead girls were speaking to her and told her where to look, and she stumbled upon a body. It would be a long time before these remains were identified as Tina Marie Thompson, and Tina had last been seen on July 26, 1983, and wasn't reported missing for quite some time. On May 9th, remains found off the highway were identified as Deborah Mae Abernathy, who'd been missing since September. On May 26th, the remains of Colleen Brockman were found in Pierce County. She'd been missing for a year and a half. So now by June 16th, 26 bodies had been found and 18 of them had been identified. During the summer of 1984, Melvin Foster was officially eliminated as a Green River Killer suspect after his car was processed and not found to have any evidence tying him to the murders. On October 12th, another mushroom hunter discovered bones 8 miles east of a site where other victims had been discovered. This skeleton was identified as Mary Bello. She was found 1 year and 1 day after she'd gone missing. Her family didn't have a funeral for her because her grandparents were afraid that her friends would realize she'd been a sex worker, which is really heartbreaking.
Yeah, that was really sad.
On November 14th, a hunter found remains close to where Mary's had been, and they were identified as Martina Arthurly. So 1985 came, and virtually no one outside the Northwest had heard of the Green River Killer. So, if you're in Seattle, in this area, you've heard of him, but otherwise, no one really knew about what was happening. And so systems were not yet in place to connect crimes throughout the country, and so they're thinking it's possible that the Green River Killer had moved to a different location, especially since it had been so long since a girl went missing, or was reported missing at least. And it was also possible he was dead or in prison, because it's just super unlikely that serial killers, just stop killing. So at this point, they're like, we're finding remains, but more women aren't really going missing, so possibly he's moved to a new area since he knows we might have upped our surveillance around the area where he was targeting women.
Yeah.
In January of 1985, the medical examiner's office released information about the 4 sets of unknown bones that no one had claimed. So the first Star Lake victim's pelvis bone had been fractured and one arm dislocated, and it was possible that this occurred while fighting off the killer, but Gail Matthews' sister-in-law read this new information nervously as she remembered that Gail had broken her pelvis in a boating accident in 1980. So forensic experts released they had obtained Gail's x-rays, and they were able to match them to the remains. And so this is when, we mentioned it took quite a while for Gail's remains to be identified. So this is officially when they were, and yeah. A month later, on March 10th, a man riding a 3-wheeler stopped on a sharp curve just east of the old Star Lake gravel pit. So he was looking around for a new place to ride his bike when something caught his eye, and he realized it was a human skull. So it was not far from where Sandra Gabbert's remains were found, and the bones had been scattered by animals, but they were able to quickly identify him as 15-year-old Carrie Royce, and she'd been missing for almost 2 years. So the first half of 1985 continued to be quiet as far as disappearances go. So on June 13th, 1985, a worker was operating a bulldozer clearing land in Oregon when he discovered skeletal remains. And a few days later, the remains were identified as Denise Darcel Bush, who had been missing since October of 1982. So only her upper jaw was available, but the upper teeth were enough to be able to make an identification, and her lower mandible would be found 5 years later near Seattle in 1990. So they're really unsure why the killer had separated these 2 parts of her skull, or, what exactly happened, because, it's pretty far to take it.
Yeah, very strange, especially for not only parts of the same body, but parts of, the skull, 2 different, both halves of the skull. It's just crazy.
So it would take a week for the second body to be identified as Shirley Marie Sherrill, who'd also disappeared from Seattle. So her killer had driven her all the way here, and they knew, he's probably just playing games with investigators. More remains were found 2 days later, so police now believed they'd found another dump site, and the last 2 girls could not be identified. So on June 28th, 1985, the FBI officially came aboard the investigation because the victims had been taken across state lines. Now makes it a federal case. They can step in. So the summer of 1985 was quiet, but there were several rapes and attempted murders in Portland that made police wonder, if he had just moved to Portland because of the increased police presence. On September 8th, a teacher accompanying a class on a visit to Seattle's Seward Park found another human skull. So search crews eventually discovered the entire skeleton, and there were no clothes at all in the vicinity. And it was Mary West, who was 17 and pregnant, and she'd gone missing on February 6, 1984, when she'd failed to return to her aunt's house. So the Green River Task Force kept coming up empty, and even with various grants and technology, they really weren't getting any leads. So they'd had a few suspects they were interested in, but no one that really just stood out. So they asked John Douglas to provide a new profile, which did help them eliminate a few suspects. And they had one suspect who had stopped a few times named Gary Ridgway. And a few detectives felt strongly about him, but others thought it couldn't be him. So he had been stopped in the past and taken a lie detector test, and he had passed it. So they were like, he's not a strong suspect. He passed a lie detector test. Just kind of put him on the bottom of the list. Mm-hmm. So there was another suspect that was strongly considered, And he is referred to as Barney Tickenborg in the book. That is an alias. So he was a middle-aged fur trapper who was very familiar with the areas where the Green River victims had been found. So other trappers commented that he was just obsessed with killing dogs and took pleasure in using different methods to kill them. And once they checked their systems, 2 people had called in concerns about him. So he really talked excitedly about his killings. He loved showing off his library that had books and magazines about human anatomy and various methods of killing people. Just kind of a weird dude.
A little bit.
He really viewed women as just like objects, and he was also known to frequent with sex workers. 10 years earlier, he had been furious because a local college student had given him a venereal disease. So I think that's kind of, we've seen that before where men get STDs and then blame the woman and then hate women when it takes 2 to tango, buddy. So he was also known to drive his truck late at night, and he did have a red police bubble on it and a police badge. So this kind of comes back how the task force thought, the killer might be pretending to be a police officer to try and get these women more likely to come with him. Mm-hmm. And the most bizarre thing was that he had a mannequin that he found in the woods, and he kept it in his truck, covered it with a tarp, and often slashed it with scalpels.
Nope. Don't like that.
I don't like that. And he'd been arrested before in 1978 for trapping on Mercer Island, where it is illegal. And detectives began, interviewing people who knew him, and he matched the profiles, more closely than any other suspect. So police are like, we are going to surveil him and watch him closely, and he's not going to sneeze without us knowing about it. So on February 6th, FBI agents were going to talk to his mother and stepfather, and they were in the process of getting together search warrants for his home and cars. But it wasn't needed for his mother's house because they just agreed, to sign a consent to search form and went ahead and let the FBI in. And his mother revealed that early in her life, her son had trouble with stealing things and had, a brush or 2 with the law over theft and burglaries. He had entered the military, but he was discharged after he was convicted of theft from a Foot Locker in the barracks. And he was married and divorced several times. So the search warrant was approved for the other locations, and FBI agents swarmed his house. And Barney and his current wife were taken to FBI headquarters, and he denied having any knowledge of the Green River murders, and he volunteered to take a lie detector and passed. So the task force is like, well, crap. This is our best suspect. He's weird. And more items were taken from his home, but in the end, 3 months later, he was eliminated as a suspect. So in March 1986, 2 Kent Park Department workers discovered human bones at the base of a large tree, and there were enough remains to know it was a young female, but not to identify her. There was no skull, mandible, or teeth, just a human torso and spine, and it would take 13 years to discover through mitochondrial DNA that these were the remains of Tracy Winston. On May 2nd, 1986, the remains of Maureen Feeney were found. She'd gone missing on September 28th, 1983, and in June 1986, Kim Nelson's skull and a few bones were found. She'd gone missing in early 1984. In 1986, Hope Redding, and this is an alias, was driving home from work along a dark road. So her car stuttered and stopped, and she tried to get it to start again, but she didn't have any luck. And a short time later, a pickup truck approached, and, so she's, checking the locks on her doors. She's like, I'm gonna be careful here. Mm-mm. So she rolled down her window a little, and he said, pop your hood. I'm pretty good at cars. So, again, this is the 80s. We don't really have cell phones. Not really much you can do. She went ahead and let him look at the car, and after 20 minutes of looking, he said, I can't fix it. It needs parts I don't have, but I can give you a ride to where you can call someone to come and get you. So, since he had spent so much time helping her, she thought she could trust him. So she grabbed her purse and followed him to his truck. And while in his truck, she reached into her purse and began to look for her wallet. And this really scared him and freaked him out. Possibly he thought she was reaching for like a gun. So she closed her purse. And they kept driving, and she saw him come up on a 7-Eleven, but he didn't stop. So she asked him, where are you going? And he just grunted. So Hope started swearing at him and yelling at him to stop the car. She's elbowing his ribs as hard as she could. And he glanced at her, and Hope realized like he'd never intended to stop. It was all just a show. So they started fighting in the truck, and she eventually fell out. And she was not going to let him overpower her, and she just kept fighting. He kept calling her a bitch, and she was very angry. And she saw him grab for a rock or something, and Hope sunk her teeth into his arms as deep as she could, and he let go. She ran and hid, and he eventually gave up and drove away. Many years later, she recognized a picture of the man who tried to kill her, and she called the Green River Task Force. So Hope's story is also pretty terrifying at the time, because before this, the Green River Killer had only targeted sex workers. But Hope hadn't been hitchhiking. She wasn't a sex worker. Her lifestyle was just completely different. And she had also been extremely cautious leading up to this, because she had been a victim of sexual assault before, and she had told herself she would never, let herself be a victim to that again, which is probably also why she fought so hard. And so at this point, the killer's kind of changing things up, which can be a little concerning, deviating from that MO.
And when I was reading the book, I was like, I wonder what I would do in this situation without a cell phone. You're pulled over on the side of the road at night. Your car is dead. What are you supposed to do? You ultimately have to trust someone who comes along. Do you just wait for a police officer, and who knows how long that could be? Or how do you determine who is trustworthy and who is not? And are you just going to sleep in your car on the side of the road? Is that going to be any safer? It's really just a lose-lose situation. What are you supposed to do?
Yeah, and that's the thing too, someone stops, looks at your car, spends 20 minutes. I don't think it's unreasonable that even today I would likely trust someone who went through that much to try and help me. So, you're just kind of in a really crappy position.
Yeah, so we do want to read the list of victims' names that we talked about in this episode. So they were Martina Teresa Otherly, Cheryl Lee Wims, Yvonne Antosh, Constance Elizabeth Naone, Kelly K. McGinnis, Kelly Ware, Carrie Ann Royce, Tammy Lyles, Rose Johnson, April Dawn Buttram, Deborah May Abernathy, Tracy Ann Winston, Maureen Feeney, Mary Sue Bellow, Yvonne Shelley Antosh, Pammy Advent, Patricia Ann Osborne, Delise Louise Plager, Kimberly Nelson, Lisa Lorraine Yates, Mary Exeter West, Bones number 8, Cindy Smith, and Bones number 10. And that is where we're going to leave off with part 2. As you guys can see from the length of the episode, this is why we had to do 3 parts. It's also a lot to do at once. I'm mentally exhausted already, so...
Yeah, it's really hard, and especially this beginning where it's just victim after victim, and just life's, being taken and no resolution. So, Patreons, you got this, same time as part 1, and you're going to get part 3 next week. And regular listeners, you're also going to get part 3 next week. It's just 2 separate weeks. So
when you're listening to this, yep.
But yeah, if you are just a regular listener and you have part 2 and you need part 3 immediately, if you sign up for Patreon, even in the lowest tier, you will get part 3 immediately.
Yes.
So that is an option if you want to do that. That's patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes.
Yes. So Courtney, what is your perk of the week?
Okay, this was hard because, back-to-back recordings, and it's 2021, and there is a lot to be thankful for, but it's kind of hard to find something that stands out. But I am going to say that my perk of the week is that my mom got her first shot of the COVID vaccine.
Yes.
Yes, she's been very nervous about it. She wanted to make a very informed decision. She was very anxious, but she talked to a lot of her coworkers and doctors and other people, and she did her research and all that, and she decided it was best for her to go ahead and get it. So she got that first shot. She said she had no side effects. She said her arm hurt for like 24 hours. After that, she was fine. She did hear that the second shot, you feel a little bit more crappy, a little bit more like flu-like symptoms. So she's just going to try to take it easy after she gets that. But I'm just so excited. You know, she's a nurse who's been working in hospitals since the beginning of this pandemic, and you know, she was saying how she personally isn't on like a floor that deals just with COVID patients, but so many people are being admitted to the hospital and then later test positive, so she's being exposed frequently, not knowing it. She has been wearing the N95 mask. She's been fine. She gets tested every time she's exposed, but I think it's just she's ready to not have to worry about giving it to someone. And yeah, I'm just super excited for her, and hopefully there's a light at the end of this pandemic tunnel.
Yes, that is super awesome. So happy for her. If you guys want to send in your shout outs to Courtney's mom, please do so, because she's amazing and she deserves all the shout outs all the time, but especially this year.
Yes, she is a superhero, I swear.
Yes.
So Jaclyn, what is your perk of the week?
So my perk of the week isn't nearly as exciting. A couple weeks ago, I mentioned that I was ready to start watching a new television show. I did not do that. What I did do was I started watching Reba. So I needed something a little lighter, a little comic relief, a little nostalgia, you know. And in the first episode of season 1, they mentioned it being like 2001. And I'm like, oh my God, was this really 20 years ago? Like, because I remember watching this when it came out. Yeah, it blows my mind. But like, my mom loved Reba and my family watched Reba when I was growing up. So it has that nostalgia factor, but like, it's still really funny. Like, it holds up. I was worried that it would be like, it's still kind of cheesy. A few problematic episodes, as you do in a 20-year-old show. Not too many, but just really, really funny. So that's been my perk of the week.
Yeah, that's always nice to have that like nostalgia show.
Yeah.
You know, to watch again, and that it does hold up. Like, I've been really wanting to rewatch Glee, but I'm scared. I'm scared I'm gonna watch it and realize just how it maybe wasn't as good as the memories I have with it. And I'm a little scared to ruin that, like, the memories I have with it. Let me know if you've rewatched Glee like a few years later, and if you enjoyed it as much as you did, you know, when it came on. Like, please let me know. But yeah, that's always good when a show holds up.
Yeah.
As good as you remember.
Definitely. So if you want to reach out to us and let us know about Glee or Reba, or send Courtney's mom her shout outs, you can do that at Instagram at Caffeinated Crimes Pod, on Twitter at Caff Crimes Pod, that's CAFF Crimes Pod, on Facebook at Caffeinated Crimes Podcast, or via email at caffeinatedcrimespod@gmail.com. And like Courtney already mentioned, if you guys want the next installment of this and other bonus episodes and goodies, you can go to patreon.com/caffeinatedcrimes.
Yeah, and we're still doing our Apple Podcast giveaway. So if you go and give us a review on Apple Podcasts, once we get to 50, we will draw a name and they'll get a pin, a sticker, and a $10 gift card to the coffee shop of your choice. Just be sure and put some identifying information, you know, send us a message before you submit it, something that we know it's you and we can actually get you your prize once we get there. But in the meantime, go have a cup of coffee.
And don't commit a crime.